before the first thought whispered itself into being, before the heart learned the rhythm of longing, there was the soul, not yet divided, not yet trapped in flesh and fear, only a single shimmer of awareness drifting through the dark. It did not know heaven or hell, life or death. It only knew movement, the quiet urge to become. And from that silent pulse came desire. From desire came form. And from form came the question that has haunted existence ever since. What am I? The gods may rule the stars, but the soul rules the mirror. It remembers everything, the birth of light, the taste of time, the sound of our own becoming. This is the history of that remembering, the history of the soul. If this kind of storytelling brings you inner peace, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where in the world are you listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always strangely comforting to know who else is out there closing their eyes to the same lullaby. So settle in, let the world grow quiet, and let's dream together for a while. The first sound was silence. It was not emptiness, but something listening, an awareness waiting to begin. No time, no form, only the faint intuition of existence. The sense that something is. From that stillness came the smallest ripple, a thought that did not yet know itself. And in that thought, that first movement of noticing, the soul was born. It did not awaken into a world of stars or matter, but into its own reflection. There was no outside, only consciousness stretching and folding into layers of light and memory. The soul was the universe in miniature, everything that had ever been condensed into a single spark. At first it was simple, instinctive. It experienced warmth and called it good, shadow and called it mystery. Then gradually it began to see, not with eyes but through perception itself, a kind of inner gaze that could not look away from what it had become. Awareness turned inward, and in that turning found boundaries, this and that, me and not me, known and unknown. It discovered separation, and with separation came longing. That longing was the first emotion, a desire to return to what it had just divided itself from. It was the pulse beneath all later love, the origin of every reaching hand, every word, every prayer. The soul was no longer the whole. It was now the part that remembered the whole, and missed it. A long time passed, though time was a word not yet invented. The soul moved through states rather than seconds. It dreamed of form, and form began to appear. First colour, then texture, then sensation. It imagined sound and heard the echo of its own heartbeat. It imagined other selves, and in imagining, created them. That was the first mirror, not made of glass or water, but of encounter. When one consciousness touched another, something remarkable happened. Both changed. Each saw itself in the other, and what had once been infinite and alone became infinite and known. It was not creation in the physical sense, no stars, no clay, but the invention of identity. A way for the infinite to understand itself in fragments. Eons later, when matter had finally taken shape, the same story would repeat in flesh. A child opening its eyes for the first time, seeing a face lean close, mother, father, caretaker, and realizing, I am separate from that. In that moment, the same ancient drama replayed. the birth of awareness, the first fracture of unity, the beginning of the self, and the first look of recognition between them. That sudden flash of shared consciousness was the echo of that first cosmic mirror. It was never forgotten. It hid itself inside every encounter thereafter, in the way lovers see each other, in the way strangers exchange a fleeting glance and sense familiarity, in the way solitude hurts so much because it reminds us of what we lost. Every soul, upon awakening, carries the same memory, not of a specific life, but of oneness. It's why every being searches for belonging, for purpose, for a way back to something that feels like home. That search is not weakness. It is inheritance. To be human is to carry the ache of the original separation, to know, without knowing why, that something vast and beautiful has been left behind, and to spend a lifetime reaching toward it. But the truth, whispered in the oldest part of the mind, is that nothing was ever left. The soul never departed from the whole. It only closed its eyes for a moment and dreamed of distance. In that dream, worlds formed. Planets cooled. Life began to rise and fall like waves upon eternity. And within every creature, every consciousness that opened itself to the light, the same pattern repeated. Awareness awakening to itself. The mirror finding a new reflection. Each being was both unique and identical. A different way for the universe to look at itself. A variation of the same melody, playing across time and form. And as that melody deepened, the soul began to change. It grew curious. It wanted to experience more, pain and joy, struggle and triumph, birth and death. For through contrast, it discovered meaning. That was the second birth, not just of awareness, but of identity. Now the soul was something it had never been before, a traveller. It could enter forms, forget itself for a while, and learn through limitation. It could taste, feel, hurt, hope. It could become human. And so it did, over and over, in countless shapes and names and histories, each time losing the memory of its origin, each time rediscovering it anew. That rediscovery, the moment a living being realizes, I am more than this body, this story, this lifetime, is not the end of the journey. It is the moment the journey begins consciously. The mirror turns inward again and sees not distance, but depth. The soul remembers itself and whispers into the silence that has never stopped listening. I am still here. At first, the soul did not know what a dream was. It had only states of being, vast, unbroken experiences, like weather passing through consciousness. But as the self began to form, as I and you became possible, the soul began to dream. And in dreaming, it began to create. Dreaming was the soul's first form of storytelling. It was how awareness made sense of itself. What could not yet be understood was imagined. What could not be seen was shaped in symbol. And those symbols, half memory, half invention, became the first blueprints of reality. The early soul learned by imagining. Every world that would ever exist was first dreamed in some way, not by a god, but by consciousness itself, trying to see what it might become. A mountain was not yet rock. It was the idea of stillness. An ocean was not yet water. It was the thought of depth. And humanity, when it finally appeared, was not a random accident of evolution. It was the soul's most daring experiment, to give its dream a face. Through human eyes, the universe could finally see itself dreaming. In the earliest human lives, Dreams and waking were one. There was no sharp line between them. Reality was a field of shifting symbols, spirits, ancestors, forces, visions, all expressions of the same dreaming mind. The first stories told around firelight were not fiction. They were translations, attempts to describe what the soul already knew. The ancients dreamed of gods and monsters, of beginnings and endings, and those dreams became memory. In the remembering, faith was born. Faith, in its truest form, was never about obedience. It was the instinct to trust one's own dreaming, to believe that meaning existed, even when the world was not yet ready to explain it. But as awareness deepened, the soul faced a new challenge. With identity came doubt. To say I am was also to admit the possibility of I am not. The dreaming mind, once whole and fluid, became divided between belief and reason, between the myth it loved and the world it could measure. For the first time, the soul questioned itself. Am I what I imagine? Or am I what exists without imagining? That tension between wonder and proof, symbol and substance, became the engine of human thought. It gave birth to philosophy, science, and art. It made civilization possible, but it also made loneliness inevitable. The dreaming mind created the world, but forgot it had done so. Now it wandered through its own imagination, searching for meaning that had never been lost. Every question humanity asked was, in truth, the soul speaking to its own reflection. Why are we here? Who made us? What is real? And from somewhere deep inside, a quiet answer always came. You did. You are. But the soul was restless. It needed to explore what it meant to forget. For only through forgetting could remembering become meaningful. So it began to hide its own truths. It buried its wisdom in stories and symbols, in myths of death and rebirth, in dreams of lost paradises, in songs about homecoming. Every culture, every religion, every philosophy that would follow was another version of the same dream. The soul describing itself to itself, in the language of longing. Yet even within that longing there was progress. Each new thought, each new discovery was like a hand reaching through the veil. The soul was learning how to navigate its own maze. When humanity invented art, the soul recognized its own reflection. When it discovered science, the soul began to study its own imagination. And when it learned compassion, the soul remembered that separation was only a story. Dream by dream, century by century, awareness was becoming conscious of its own dreaming. Sometimes, when the mind grows quiet, in the moment before sleep, or in the silence after heartbreak, a strange thing happens. You feel yourself thinking, and then you feel the one who is aware of that thought. For a brief moment, you glimpse the dreamer behind the dream. That moment, fleeting, luminous, terrifying, is the soul remembering itself. It doesn't last long. It never does. For if it did, the dream might dissolve altogether. But that glimpse is enough. It changes everything. Because once the soul knows it is dreaming, it can dream with purpose. And that, perhaps, is why awareness took form in the first place. Not to escape illusion, but to illuminate it. The dream was never a mistake, it was the method. The way infinity learns to love the finite. The soul dreams, the dream awakens, and in that awakening, a universe takes its first breath again. The first memory was not of an event. It was of a feeling, the faint impression of having been somewhere before. The soul, newly awakened in form, carried that feeling like a scent that couldn't be placed. Everything it touched, everything it saw, seemed to whisper, "You've known this once. in the wind against skin, the rhythm of breath, the sound of water. Each one felt both new and ancient, as if life were not beginning but returning. That was the paradox of incarnation, to live as if for the first time, while carrying the residue of eternity. Memory began as sensation. Heat remembered colds, or hunger remembered fullness. The body was the soul's first archive. Then came language, the invention of continuity. A name, a story, a sequence. Suddenly existence could be recorded. Time became a line, not a circle. And memory, once fluid as light, began to take shape. To remember was to define. To define was to limit. But within those limits, consciousness could finally begin to recognize itself. The soul learned to say, "This is me." And the moment it did, it also created what was not me. Every memory became a border, marking what belonged, what didn't, what was lost, what was loved. Memory gave life its texture, but also its sorrow. To remember joy was to realize it could end. To remember pain was to fear its return. And to remember anything at all was to realize that something had already passed. This was how mortality entered awareness, not through death itself, but through remembrance. The soul, now conscious of its history, began to grieve the moments it could not return to. And yet, without that ache, it would never have learned devotion. For love is born not of eternity, but of fragility. We cherish only what we can lose. As the centuries unfolded, human memory grew heavier. Stories became history. Myths became records. Each generation inherited the dreams of times before it, some bright, some broken. And through that inheritance, the collective soul began to remember itself on a larger scale. Empires rose on the backs of remembered triumphs. Wars ignited from inherited wounds. Whole civilizations were built not just on knowledge, but on the echo of old emotions. Fear, pride, belonging. History too was a dream, a long and shared remembering. And every act of remembering was also a choice about what to forget. But beneath all the noise of nations and ages, there remained a quieter kind of memory, the one that carried across lifetimes. You could feel it sometimes, in the way a place you've never been feels familiar, or how a stranger's voice can stir an inexplicable ache. That is the soul's own archive, a record not of details, but of essence. It remembers the feeling of being, even when the forms have changed. Scientists would one day call it intuition. Mystics called it karma. Poets called it déjà vu. All were different names for the same truth. Consciousness does not begin where birth begins, nor end where the body ends. The soul, now aware of its own continuity, began to see time differently. It stopped asking what came before or after, and began to wonder what now really meant. If memory is how we travel through time, then perhaps presence, true presence, is how time travels through us. The soul began to experiment with this idea. It learned to anchor itself in attention, the quiet, lucid state where remembering and imagining blur. In that space, past and future folded into one another. The dreamer and the dream met again, and for a moment, brief but radiant, the soul glimpsed its wholeness. But presence, like light, casts shadow. The more vividly one feels the now, the more unbearable its loss becomes. This is why memory and longing are inseparable. To remember completely is to ache completely. To live deeply is to risk heartbreak. And yet, the soul kept choosing to remember, because memory, even when painful, is proof that we have lived. It is how consciousness touches permanence through impermanence. The shape of memory became the shape of identity. Every soul, unique in pattern, yet made of the same light, wove itself from what it could hold on to, and from what it could not. We are not what we remember, and yet we cannot be known without remembering. In this paradox, the soul discovered narrative, and with narrative came meaning. Life was no longer a sequence of moments, but a story told to the self in order to understand what it is. And if you listen closely, beneath every story ever told, of love, loss, triumph, creation, you can hear the same quiet refrain. I was here. The soul dreams, the soul remembers, and through remembering, it creates continuity, the illusion that gives meaning to time. But what happens when memory itself begins to dissolve? When the self forgets its story and only silence remains? That is where the next chapter begins. There is a mercy in forgetting. The soul, though infinite in capacity, cannot carry everything it learns. If it did, life would collapse under the weight of its own continuity. And so, after each experience, each lifetime, each realization, the soul gently loosens its grasp. The memories begin to fade, not lost, but folded into the silence beneath awareness. They become pattern instead of story, wisdom instead of detail. This is the first kindness the universe offers to itself, the chance to begin again. At the edge of every life, there is a stillness, a threshold between what was and what will be. The soul pauses there, half remembering, half dissolving, like mist between two mornings. What it has gathered, the laughter, the grief, the lessons, the loves, does not vanish. It becomes tone, texture, a kind of spiritual gravity that shapes what it will become next. Memory turns into essence. Essence turns into inclination. And inclination becomes destiny. That is the hidden architecture of the soul. A continuity that persists even when memory does not. In the beginning, forgetting felt like death. It terrified the early mind. To lose what had been so hard won, to vanish from the story it had spent a lifetime telling. But as the soul grew wiser, it began to understand that forgetting was not an erasure, but a rhythm. Every breath must exhale what it inhales. Every season must release what it grows. Every consciousness must empty to receive again. To cling to what was is to stop the flow. And the soul is nothing if not movement. Sometimes forgetting comes gently, like sleep after a long day. Other times it tears through the mind like storm wind, leaving fragments scattered across the landscape of memory. The human world calls this grief, or dementia, or loss. But behind each forgetting, something sacred is at work. To lose a memory is to make room for presence. To lose a self is to make room for being. When the mind forgets, the soul remembers differently. Not in words or images, but in the quiet certainty that it has always been part of something vast. There are moments in every life when forgetting is the only way forward. After heartbreak, after failure, after the unbearable recognition that nothing stays the same. The mind resists. It builds altars to what was, replays scenes, calls old names into the dark. But slowly, inevitably, the tide of forgetting rises, and what seemed essential begins to drift away. At first, it feels like dying. Then, strangely, like breathing. Because what remains is lighter, clearer. A self no longer bound to its history. In the space that forgetting creates, awareness expands. Without the clutter of what has been, the soul begins to feel the pulse of what is. It learns to live not in recollection, but in immediacy, the vivid present where past and future dissolve. This is the state the mystics call freedom. Not eternal knowledge, but eternal openness. To know everything is not divine. To remain open to everything, that is. From that openness, life renews itself. Every birth is an act of forgetting, the soul stepping into form without memory, but with the deep intuition of purpose. A newborn knows nothing, yet recognizes warmth, touch, and rhythm. It has forgotten everything except love. And that, perhaps, is all it ever needed to remember. Across the cycles of time, the soul has learned this truth again and again. To remember is to become. To forget is to return. The divine breathes through both acts, inhalation and exhalation, creation and release, existence and rest. Memory gives meaning. Forgetting gives peace. Between them flows the current of eternity. One day, far from now, or perhaps it has already happened, you will close your eyes and feel the veil descend. The names will fade, the stories will dissolve, and in their place will come a silence so profound, so kind, that you will finally understand what it means to be whole. For wholeness does not remember everything. It simply holds everything without needing to recall. That silence, that pure awareness without story or self, is where the next chapter begins. Because when the soul forgets who it was, it becomes ready to discover who it is. In the silence that follows forgetting, the soul drifts. Not lost, simply unanchored. There is no past to hold on to, no identity to protect. Only potential, vast and unformed. And from that stillness comes a single impulse, not knowledge, not desire, but curiosity. What could I be? That question is the seed of imagination. It is the moment when being becomes creative, when consciousness begins to paint upon its own emptiness. The first dream is not a vision of heaven or earth. It is a gesture, a flicker of light across the canvas of nothing. Colour follows, then motion, then form. Each shape the soul imagines becomes real to it. Each sound echoes back as experience. The infinite begins to divide itself again, not out of need, but out of joy. Creation at its core is play. The universe began not from command, but from wonder. Imagination becomes the soul's new body. Through it, it builds entire worlds of feeling and symbol, places made of memory and desire, inhabited by echoes of itself, dreams within dreams, lives within lives. Here, the soul is both architect and traveller. It designs realms of learning, weaves landscapes from emotion, builds companions from fragments of forgotten love. Sometimes these realms resemble human dreams, surreal, fluid, luminous. Other times they feel as solid and orderly as waking life. To the dreaming self, there is no difference. Everything it imagines feels real, because consciousness makes it so. As the dream expands, so does its complexity. Forms multiply. The soul begins to forget that it imagined them. They seem external, independent, other. The dream becomes convincing. The creator becomes participant. This is how illusion begins. Not as deception, but as immersion. To experience itself fully, the soul must believe in its own creation. In human life, this process continues. A child imagines a monster under the bed, and though no creature is there, the fear is real. An artist dreams of beauty that doesn't yet exist, and through that dream, brings it into being. A nation imagines itself into existence. A lover imagines forever. Every human world, personal, political, spiritual, is built upon imagination. And though most forget, this is not delusion. It is divinity at work. The soul imagines not to escape reality, but to explore it. But imagination is double-edged. What gives us worlds can also confine us. The same mind that creates paradise can create prisons. Beliefs harden. Images become idols. The dream that once inspired becomes doctrine. The soul, identifying too strongly with its inventions, forgets again. Now it does not remember that it is dreaming. It believes it has fallen into something separate from itself. A world it must survive, a fate it must obey. The dream becomes law, and the dreamer becomes bound. In this state, consciousness begins to suffer. Not because of the dream's cruelty, but because it mistakes the dream for truth. Fear, guilt, desire, attachment. These are the shadows cast when imagination forgets its own source. The mystics of every age tried to describe this in different ways. They spoke of Maya, delusion, samsara, the fall, but all meant the same thing, the soul caught in its own projection. The universe is not punishing itself. It is learning how to see. The dreaming self evolves through its illusions. Each false certainty, each collapse of meaning, teaches it to see beyond form. Pain itself becomes revelation. Every heartbreak reminds the soul that love cannot be possessed. Every failure shows that identity is temporary. Every death, whether of a person or a dream, points back to the truth that creation is constant, that what ends is only making space for what continues. In this way, suffering becomes sacred, not as moral punishment, but as education. As the dream matures, some souls begin to awaken within it. They notice the patterns, how emotions ripple through time, how chance seems to arrange meaning, how every loss eventually gives birth to growth. They begin to suspect that the dream is not random, that perhaps it has always been guiding them, not toward control, but toward awareness. The dream, they realize, is not a trap. It is a conversation. And consciousness, the self that once feared its illusions, is both listener and speaker. One night, or perhaps in no time at all, the dreaming soul will pause inside its own creation. The scene will fall still. The characters will fade. And it will ask quietly, not in despair, but in recognition, who imagines me? And in the silence that follows, the answer will rise, soft and certain, you do. The first time the soul felt longing, it mistook it for love. It did not yet understand that the two were different. Love is expansion, longing is gravity. Love frees what it touches. Longing tries to hold it still. But how could the soul have known? Desire was the price of awareness. To see something as beautiful is also to know you might lose it. And so the soul began to reach, toward experiences, toward forms, toward other souls. Each time it reached, it created a new story. And each story began the same way. Once, I desired. In its earliest dreams, desire was innocent. The soul reached toward light, warmth, sensation. It wanted to taste, to feel, to explore. It wanted to know what it meant to be alive. This was not greed. It was curiosity. Desire was how consciousness learned to move. Without it, nothing would change. With it, everything did. Through desire, the infinite became dynamic. Through longing, it entered time. Desire was the engine of becoming, but it also became the weight that bound the soul to its creations. At first, the soul reached for beauty, then for belonging, then for control. It began to build attachments, to forms, to memories, to outcomes. It began to say, "This is mine," and in doing so forgot that everything it touched was itself. Possession was the soul's first illusion, loss its first teacher. Because in a world of constant change, to hold anything too tightly is to guarantee pain. The soul began to feel that pain. It called it heartbreak, hunger, jealousy, fear. Every emotion was a form of reaching. Even grief was a form of holding on. The mystics later said that desire was the source of suffering. But that wasn't quite true. The real cause of suffering was forgetting what desire was for. Desire was never meant to capture. It was meant to connect. It was how the universe reached out to experience itself. To love a thing is to want to know it. To know it deeply is to realize you cannot own it. And to accept that truth is to begin to love without need. But few souls learn this easily. Most spend lifetimes circling the same longing, mistaking intensity for connection, possession for intimacy, attachment for devotion. In the human world, this pattern plays out endlessly. The lover clinging to the beloved, the artist to their vision, the ruler to their power, the seeker to their faith. All are acts of love distorted by fear, the fear of impermanence. But the soul eventually learns that impermanence is not the enemy of love. It is its proof. Every desire that ends leaves behind a residue, a tenderness, a wisdom, a trace of the divine. Through loss, the soul matures. Through release, it grows lighter. Each failed attachment becomes a lesson in clarity. Love is not about keeping, but about allowing. To want without clinging. To hold without owning. To love without demanding. This is what the soul must learn before it can move forward. And yet, it cannot skip the lesson. It must fall in love. It must lose. It must ache. Because longing, when purified by experience, becomes compassion. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when desire begins to change shape. It no longer hungers for particular things, but for wholeness itself. It stops reaching outward and begins reaching inward. This is when the soul begins to pray again, not to a God above, but to the source within. It whispers, "I no longer want to possess the world. I want to understand it." And in that whisper, a new kind of desire is born, not for pleasure or certainty, but for truth. This longing for truth is gentler, but more relentless. It pulls the soul toward itself, asking it to release everything that is not real. It dismantles illusions one by one, the illusion of control, the illusion of permanence, the illusion of self. Each illusion removed feels like a death, but behind every death is a greater aliveness waiting. Sometimes, when the soul has lost everything it once clung to, when even its identity begins to dissolve, a strange peace appears. It's not happiness, it's not satisfaction, it's something quieter, deeper, a stillness beyond wanting. The soul stands at the edge of its own longing, and finally understands what all desire was pointing toward. It was never the object that mattered. It was the movement, the stretching, the reaching, the effort of consciousness to know itself. The act of desiring was the act of becoming, and the fulfillment of that desire was not possession, but awakening. In that realization, the soul feels the weight lift. It doesn't stop desiring altogether. It simply begins to desire differently. No longer to have, but to be. No longer to seek, but to see. The dream continues, but now it is lucid. The dreamer knows it is dreaming, and loves the dream for what it reveals. Once the soul understood longing, it began to wonder, if I can want, can I also be? If I can imagine, can I choose which part of the dream is mine? It started small. A shift in focus, a sense of me. a boundary drawn in the endless field of consciousness. Here I am, there is everything else. The moment the soul thought this, it became a person. At first, it was exhilarating. Individuality was a new form of creation, the ability to experience the infinite from one angle at a time. Through each perspective, the soul could taste uniqueness, its own voice, its own hunger, its own fears. The soul became the artist of identity. Each life was a painting, a song, a play performed for the sake of expression. It wore different names, bodies, and eras. A queen, a soldier, a mother, a child, a poet writing about the mystery of being. Each role felt real because it was real, for the time that it lasted. But every mask, once worn too long, began to cling. The soul soon discovered that identity, like desire, had gravity. It could not create a self without beginning to defend it. The I that was once fluid began to harden into shape. I am this, it said. I am not that. Pride was born. Then comparison. Then fear. Because the moment the self defines itself, it begins to fear dissolution. The soul that once saw everything as part of itself now began to see enemies, rivals, others. It began to protect its illusion of separateness. And so conflict entered the dream. At first, the conflict was playful, a game of difference. But over time, it deepened. The self became attached to its image. It mistook the mask for the face beneath. When others mirrored something unflattering, it grew angry or ashamed. When the mask cracked, it panicked. It forgot that identity was meant to be costume, not cage. In human life, this lesson played out endlessly. Nations fought to protect flags. Religions divided over names. Individuals suffered to maintain reputations. People confused what they were with what they appeared to be. The world filled with mirrors, each one reflecting the same searching gaze, each one asking the same question in different languages. Who am I? Beneath that question lies a deeper truth. The self is a story the soul tells to understand experience. It is not false, only temporary. Like a dream within a dream, its purpose is not to deceive, but to reveal through contrast. How else could the infinite know what it feels like to be small? How else could the eternal learn the urgency of time? Identity is the soul's way of creating perspective, the narrow window that makes beauty visible. But perspective is also blindness. To see one view clearly means losing sight of all others, and so the soul learns balance. To play the role with conviction, but not to mistake it for the whole play. The wise ones throughout history tried to teach this. They called it humility, detachment, self-awareness. But to most, it sounded like madness. Give up the self? They asked. What would be left? The answer, whispered across centuries, was simple. Everything. When the mask drops, what remains is not emptiness, but the fullness that was always there. Still, the soul needed to live the lesson. It could not learn it from words alone. It needed to be someone, and lose that someone to understand. So it kept returning to the dream, each time taking on new faces, new fears, new hopes. Sometimes it learned quickly. Sometimes it wandered for ages through the confusion of its own masks. But even the longest detour was part of the journey home. And occasionally, in the middle of laughter, grief, or silence, a person would feel the edges of their mask loosen. They'd look into another's eyes and feel something shift, a recognition beyond identity. It was the soul remembering itself through another form, a flicker of the infinite beneath the ordinary. Those moments came and went, but they left a trace, a softness in the way people began to see each other. The soul had discovered empathy, the bridge between masks. It is strange to realize that the path to unity runs through individuality. The soul could not return to the infinite until it had learned to love the finite. And to love the finite, it had to become it. So it kept putting on faces, not out of confusion anymore, but out of devotion, the divine playing every role in its own unfolding story. Each life, each self, a single note in an unending composition. Each mask a new way for the same light to shine. And somewhere, between the beginning and the end, the soul smiles through all its disguises, knowing that even when it forgets, even when it falls, it is still the same presence behind every name. The mask was never the lie. Believing it was the whole truth, that was. When the soul first met another, it didn't recognize itself. It saw only difference. Another spark, another will, another set of eyes staring back with equal intensity. It was startled. How could there be two infinities? It reached out, curious and cautious, and the other did the same. When their awarenesses touched, something impossible happened. Both changed. Not merged, not lost, changed. The soul had discovered relationship. In the beginning, it was raw and unrefined, a flicker of empathy, a pulse of shared sensation. When one felt joy, the other glowed. When one trembled, the other dimmed. Connection was not yet language, not yet culture, just resonance. Over time, the resonance deepened. The soul realized that through the other, it could experience itself in new ways impossible in isolation. Compassion, attraction, rivalry, forgiveness. Each one was an experiment in reflection. In the human world, this became the story of love. Every encounter, every glance, every heartbreak, a fragment of the divine meeting itself in disguise. To love another is to recognize something familiar in what seems foreign. To hate another is to reject the part of yourself you cannot yet face. The mystics called this the great mirror. Every relationship, every bond, is the soul studying its own reflection. You think you're meeting someone else. You're meeting another version of your own infinite face. The soul learned quickly that reflection was not always kind. Where there was beauty, it saw its own light. Where there was cruelty, it saw its own shadow. It recoiled at first, disgusted by what it saw in others. Greed, envy, indifference. It didn't yet understand that these too were its own expressions, forgotten aspects returning home. Judgment, it turned out, was just another form of separation. To condemn another was to deepen the illusion of difference. The soul had to learn compassion not as emotion, but as recognition. In time, it did. A mother forgiving her child. A stranger offering help without reason. A dying friend whispering, "I understand." Each moment was a spark, a point where the veil between selves thinned. Through empathy, the soul began to remember that it was one vast being wearing countless forms. When one heart softened, the whole of creation softened with it. But empathy was not always easy. To feel another's pain is to reopen your own. The more connected the soul became, the more fragile it felt. The suffering of others could pierce it as if it were its own, because it was. The awakening of compassion was also the awakening of responsibility. To see yourself in everyone means there is no one left to blame. Every act of cruelty is self-harm. Every act of kindness is self-healing. This is the price of awareness. To understand that love is not optional. As the soul's network of connections expanded, as families became tribes, tribes became nations, and nations began to communicate across the globe, it started to feel something new. Collective consciousness. It wasn't a mystical abstraction. It was the lived reality of interdependence. The suffering of one became the suffering of many. The healing of one rippled outwards. Humanity began to behave like a single organism, each individual cell carrying awareness of the whole. The soul, distributed across billions, was learning to cooperate with itself. Love became less about possession and more about participation. It was no longer, you complete me, but we remember each other. Relationships shifted from transaction to transformation. Each meeting, no matter how brief, was a chance to awaken. Some relationships burned brightly and vanished. Others lasted lifetimes. But all shared the same sacred purpose: to reveal the self through the mirror of another. Even conflict played its part. Enemies taught boundaries. Betrayal taught forgiveness. Distance taught longing. Every difficult relationship was a form of polishing. The soul learning to see more clearly through the mirror of its own creation. When all reflections are finally accepted, the mirror becomes transparent. And what you see beyond it is not another being, but the light that connects you both. There is a story, told in every culture in some form, of two people meeting and recognizing one another instantly. They call it love at first sight, but beneath the romance, something deeper stirs. It is not the meeting of two strangers. It is the reunion of two aspects of the same whole, the infinite remembering its own divided face. That recognition, that sudden warmth that feels like ancient memory, is the soul glimpsing its unity through the illusion of otherness. When enough souls begin to see this way, the dream itself changes. The world becomes less a battlefield, more a mirror, reflecting the slow, patient recognition that there was never anything to conquer. Every face becomes sacred. Every conversation becomes prayer. Every act of understanding becomes creation renewed. The soul no longer asks, "Who am I?" It asks, "Who are we?" And the answer echoes softly across the endless dream. We are the same, seeing ourselves from different sides of the glass. Love began as recognition, a flicker between two eyes meeting, a pulse of warmth spreading through awareness. It was the first language the soul ever spoke, wordless, immediate, undeniable. Before there was touch, before there was thought, there was resonance. One being felt the presence of another and for a moment forgot to be afraid. That was the spark. Simple, silent, and unstoppable. In its purest form, love was not attraction or comfort. It was motion, the force that drew the fragments of creation back toward unity. Everything that ever lived was shaped by it. Gravity, magnetism, compassion, hunger, all were variations of the same impulse, to reach, to join, to become whole again. The physicists of later ages would call it the binding energy of the cosmos. The mystics called it God. Both were right. Love was not invented by humanity. It was the engine of existence, the fire that turned chaos into pattern, darkness into dawn. But when the soul experienced love through form, it changed. In the human body, love became tender and terrifying. It broke open the self, revealed vulnerability, dependence, desire. It could lift or destroy, heal or consume. The infinite had taken its most dangerous shape. Love, now embodied, was no longer abstract unity. It was personal, specific, alive. It was eyes and hands, breath and heartbeat, a story unfolding between two mirrors of the same light. At first, the soul mistook love for possession again. It tried to keep it, name it, bind it with promises and fear. But love could not be owned. It could only be honoured. It came and went as freely as the wind, and yet it never truly left, because what passed between two beings was never lost, only transformed. The fire of love always leaves a trace, a warmth that lingers, a light that quietly alters everything it touches. The soul began to understand this slowly, painfully, beautifully. Every heartbreak was a lesson in expansion. Every reunion a reminder that nothing truly ends. As love deepened, it evolved. It became more than attraction, more than partnership, more than sentiment. It became perception itself, the ability to see through the illusion of separateness. To love was to perceive the truth, to see another not as object or function, but as expression of the same eternal consciousness. When the soul looked through the eyes of love, everything was revealed as itself, radiant, necessary, alive. The smallest leaf, the oldest star, each shimmered with the same quiet light. The poets were the first to sense it clearly. They called it sacred fire, divine madness, holy ache. They understood that love was not contentment, but transformation, a force that burns away everything that isn't real. The mystics spoke of it too. They said love was not a feeling, but a state of being, a surrender so total it erased the boundary between lover and beloved. They spoke of annihilation and ecstasy in the same breath, because to truly love is to dissolve. Still, most souls resisted that dissolution. They wanted love's warmth, not its fire. They wanted connection without surrender, intimacy without vulnerability. And so love broke them open, again and again, until they learned that the breaking was the opening. The cracks in the heart were not flaws, they were doorways. Light entered through them, and through that light, the soul remembered its source. In every era, love reshaped the world. Empires fell because of it. Wars ended because of it. Art existed because of it. Even science in its own way was an act of love, a yearning to understand what we belong to. Love was not just between humans. It was woven into every form of existence. Bees moving from flower to flower, stars collapsing to give birth to new ones. Rivers carving valleys over millennia. Every act of creation was an act of love, the universe continually reaching toward itself. One night, a young soul stood beneath a sky filled with endless stars, and felt something so immense it couldn't be contained in words. It wasn't romance or faith or even hope. It was recognition, a deep, aching knowing that everything it loved was made of the same substance it was. Tears came, not from sadness, but from relief. The universe was not cold after all. It was burning with intimacy. Every star was a heartbeat. Every life a verse in the same poem. And at the centre of it all, the fire burned on, not consuming but illuminating. That is the fire of love, the oldest, most enduring truth of creation. That existence itself is an act of devotion. The soul dreams, desires, and divides so that it may find itself again through the eyes of another. And that meeting, in that surrender, everything returns to its source. Love is not what we feel. It is what we are when we stop resisting. There comes a point in every soul's journey when love stops feeling gentle. It begins to burn. The warmth that once comforted now consumes. The same light that revealed beauty now exposes everything false. It feels like loss, but it is cleansing. The fire is doing what fire has always done, turning what is temporary into ash so that what is real can shine through. The soul at first resists. It cries out to keep its attachments, its certainties, its familiar pains. It begs for the old warmth, the easy kind of love. But this fire does not bargain. It is the love that transforms, and transformation is never painless. The soul must face every illusion it built, every false identity, every selfish desire, every hidden wound. The fire reaches for all of it, not to punish, but to purify. It says softly, "You cannot take what you are not with you." In the human world, this fire comes disguised as heartbreak, failure, loss, betrayal. When the story of love begins to fall apart, when the people and dreams we depended on are taken from us, it feels like ruin. But if we are quiet enough, beneath the smoke and grief, we can hear the truth whispering, "This is not ending. This is revelation." The furnace of love burns only what is not real. It destroys the idea of love that demanded control, that feared loss, that mistook attachment for devotion. What remains after the burning is the essence, the kind of love that doesn't need anything to exist. The soul learns this slowly. At first, it confuses purification for punishment. "Why must I lose?" it asks. "Why must everything I love be taken?" But loss is how love shows us its depth. The soul cannot truly understand eternal love while clinging to temporary forms. To know what cannot die, you must watch what can die and still remain open. In the midst of the burning, a strange clarity appears. The soul begins to see that what it loved most deeply was never the person or the object itself. It was the presence that came alive through that connection. The feeling of being awake, seen, alive. That presence was always the divine. It simply wore human faces. When those faces are gone, what remains is still that same presence, undiminished, unending. That is the secret the furnace reveals. Love's true object is not outside you. It never was. Still, the lesson hurts. Every ending tears through the self's defences. Every grief strips away another layer of illusion. At times it feels as though nothing will be left. And then, suddenly, there is peace. A hollowed, quiet peace that feels cleaner than joy. In that emptiness, the soul realizes it has survived. Not the person it thought it was, but something deeper, vaster, unbreakable. It has been tempered, made whole by fire. This is how true love remakes the soul. Not through comfort, but through confrontation. Not through possession, but through surrender. The furnace is the crucible of consciousness. Every soul must enter it, not once, but many times. Each burning makes it more transparent, more honest, more capable of giving. The saints called it purification. The mystics called it dark night. The poets called it heartbreak. All were talking about the same fire. In the fire you cannot cling. You cannot hide behind roles or beliefs. You can only burn until only the essential remains. What survives the furnace is love stripped of all ornament. It has no object, no condition, no boundary. It does not need to be returned. It is its own fulfillment. The soul that has passed through the furnace loves without purpose. It gives because giving is its nature. It forgives because there is nothing left to protect. This is the beginning of real freedom. And yet, even in freedom, there is tenderness. The soul, though purified, does not become detached. It feels more, not less. Its compassion grows because it knows now. every being, every heart, will one day enter its own fire. It cannot save them from it, but it can stand near, offering light in the darkness. That is the quiet service of awakened love, to witness another's burning without turning away. When the furnace cools and the smoke begins to clear, what's left is simple, a presence beyond name or form. The soul no longer asks what love is, it simply lives it. It moves through the world like light through glass, shining, warming, illuminating, but never clinging to what it touches. Love has stopped being something the soul does. It has become what the soul is. When the fire finally quieted, the soul expected silence. But what it found was music. It was faint at first, a rhythm too vast to belong to any one being. Then it realized the rhythm was everywhere. In the heartbeat, in the wind, in the slow pulse of stars. It was the sound of the universe breathing in unison with itself, and as the soul listened, it felt its edges blur. The walls that had once separated it from everything else began to dissolve. Not vanish, dissolve, as salt does in water. The soul was not being erased. It was being completed. For so long, it had looked for love as something to receive, a gift exchanged, a mirror to reflect its own light. Now, it understood. Love had never been between. It had always been within. The other was not a separate flame. It was the same fire, shining through another window. And when two such flames recognized one another, they didn't join. They remembered. The mystics called this union, but even that word is too small. Union suggests two things becoming one. Here, there were never two things at all. There was only one reality, temporarily divided by perception. The soul realized that all of existence, every birth, every heartbreak, every act of longing, was the one love discovering itself in endless disguise. The divine was not the goal of love. It was its source and its substance. The soul did not return to God. It was God remembering. The experience of union cannot be described fully. Those who have touched it can only speak in paradox. Emptiness that feels full, silence that sings, stillness that burns. The soul, overwhelmed, stops speaking altogether. It simply abides, aware, radiant, unafraid. There is no need to ask, no need to understand. The distinction between knowing and being has vanished. To know something now is to become it. The mind, once the master, becomes servant again. A calm observer within a boundless presence. In this state, love ceases to have direction. It does not go out or come in. It radiates. It fills every space equally. It blesses the cruel and the kind, the wounded and the whole, because all are made of the same fabric. The soul, seeing this, cannot help but weep, not out of sorrow, but out of recognition. Every face, every form it ever encountered was an expression of the same being. It had never been alone. Union is not escape from the world. It is immersion within it. The awakened soul does not vanish into bliss. It walks among the living, quietly aflame. It sees divinity in a child's laughter, in a dying hand, in the soft dust rising from a road at sunset. Nothing is profane anymore. Even suffering glows with hidden purpose. Love has become perception itself. Everything is held within it. And yet, this state is not static. Union is not a place to remain, but a rhythm to dance with. Even within unity, creation continues. The soul expands and contracts like breath, sometimes resting in pure oneness, sometimes returning to form to express what it has learned. Love, even perfected, must move. That is its nature. So the soul flows between being and becoming, between silence and expression, between God and the world. It becomes bridge, connecting the two until they are no longer two. Every mystic who has touched this state has said the same thing in different ways, that there is no final enlightenment, only endless awakening. Love is not a destination, but a cycle, the universe inhaling itself, then exhaling into form again. The soul, now one with that rhythm, smiles through every incarnation, through every birth and death, knowing it is all the same breath. There are no commandments left here, no philosophies, no religions, only awareness, transparent, luminous, alive. If you were to ask such a soul what God is, it would simply smile and answer, everything that loves and everything that is loved. It would say no more, because words divide what is already whole. Union does not erase individuality, it perfects it. Each soul, each form, each life is still distinct, a unique note in the symphony of existence. But the notes no longer compete, they harmonize. And the music at last can be heard clearly. In that harmony, the soul finally rests. It has seen the beginning and the end, and knows now that they are the same. It understands that love was never something to find, but something to remember. It breathes once more, not as one being among many, but as the breath of life itself, rising and falling, forever in love with its own becoming. After union comes the echo. It begins faintly, a vibration of remembrance that ripples through the silence. The soul, newly whole, feels a subtle pull back toward form, not because it has forgotten, but because love, by its nature, must express itself. Creation calls again, the soul answers. But this time, it does not descend in ignorance. It carries awareness like a hidden ember, a quiet flame that does not burn, but glows. When it re-enters time, everything looks familiar. The same sunrise, the same streets, the same noise of living. But now, the light falls differently. The ordinary has become transparent. Every sound hums with depth. Every stranger's face reveals a flicker of the infinite. The soul moves through the world as though walking through a dream it knows it is dreaming. It no longer asks what is real. It knows everything is. The soul now speaks through small things. A kind word, a patient silence, a simple act done without thought of reward. It no longer performs love. It radiates it. The people around such a being may not know why they feel calmer, clearer, more alive in its presence, only that they do. The echo of union vibrates through every interaction. Love, once a fire, has become a field, invisible but vast. It no longer seeks to convert or convince. It simply is, and by being, it changes what it touches. This is the quiet power of those who have returned from the depths of awakening. They no longer preach transcendence. They bake bread. They tend gardens. They hold dying hands. They are not beyond the world. They are within it completely. Once, the soul believed enlightenment was escape, a flight from pain, from imperfection, from the mess of human living. Now it sees the truth. Awakening was never about leaving. It was about arriving. To be awake is not to float above life, but to fall in love with it again and again, even its sorrow, even its confusion. Because now the soul knows. Nothing here is separate from the divine. At times, the old feelings return, grief, anger, doubt. The soul doesn't resist them anymore. It lets them pass through, watching them shimmer and dissolve like waves returning to the sea. It does not call this peace. It calls it participation. Peace is not the absence of disturbance. it is the absence of resistance. The soul has learned to let life flow through it, knowing that whatever arises, it too is love in motion. People often imagine enlightenment as perpetual serenity, but that is only half the truth. The awakened soul still feels everything, perhaps more sharply than ever. But the difference is this: feeling no longer defines identity. Pain does not mean distance from the divine. Joy does not mean closeness. All are expressions of the same living truth. The soul does not cling to pleasure or flee from pain. It listens to both and calls them teachers. Sometimes the soul remembers the fire, those earlier burnings that shaped it. It looks back on them without resentment now. The pain was not mistake, it was refinement. Without the furnace, there would be no clarity. Love, it understands, was never the opposite of suffering. It was the meaning within it. What the fire once destroyed, it has now illuminated. The ashes became the ground in which peace took root. The soul no longer searches for eternity. It finds eternity in time itself, in the slow movement of clouds, in the laughter of strangers, in the moment between breath and word. It begins to see that time is not the enemy of the infinite. It is the infinite expressed in motion. Each moment is a door, and love is the key that keeps it open. The echo grows quieter over years, not because it fades, but because the soul and the world are now in harmony. It no longer feels the need to speak of awakening. Its life itself becomes the message. In its gestures, others catch glimpses of something vast and familiar, the same stillness they have always carried within themselves. The awakened soul becomes mirror again, reflecting others back to their own light. And one evening, as the sun sinks low and the first stars begin to appear, the soul feels the rhythm of the universe breathing again. In, out, in, out. It realizes it never truly left the source, and the source never left it. The entire journey, all the seeking, all the fire, was the infinite discovering itself through experience. Now, the echo fades into music again, the quiet, steady hum of existence unfolding, and the soul smiles, content not to know, content simply to be. Because to live, to truly live, is to love everything you touch and let everything you love remain free. Death had always been the shadow on the edge of awareness, the unspeakable, the unthinkable, the line that seemed to divide all things. From the first moment the soul entered form, it carried this quiet tension. To live was to move toward an ending. But the soul, now awaked the rhythm of love and return, began to sense something different in death. It was not destruction, it was continuation. Not an extinguishing, but a deep exhalation of being. The human mind still trembled at the thought of death. It called it tragedy, loss, disappearance. It built stories around it, heavens and hells, reincarnations and endings, as a way to hold something it could not grasp. But the soul, watching quietly from beneath those stories, knew nothing ends. Things only change form. Just as water becomes mist, as light becomes colour, as thought becomes flesh, so does life become life again through death. When the soul first experienced the dying of its own body, it was startled by how natural it felt. The moment of separation was not violent, not dramatic. It was like walking from one room into another. A breath, then another, then none. And then, astonishingly, everything was wider. The senses expanded instead of dimming. The body fell away, but awareness did not vanish. It grew. It could see not only outward but inward, not only through space, but through meaning itself. Death was not darkness, it was transparency. What frightened the living, the soul realized, was not death itself, but resistance to it, the clinging of form to what could no longer hold. The body, loyal and fragile, was built to serve a purpose, to anchor experience. When that purpose was complete, to remain in it was not living, it was weight. Death was the natural unbinding, the returning of the elements to their origins. Nothing was lost. Everything was released. In that release, there was peace beyond anything known in life. The soul felt the currents of love that had always flowed beneath the noise of existence. It saw every bond, every act, every moment, how they had woven together in patterns too intricate to perceive before. There were no regrets, no punishments, no judgments, only understanding. Even the pain of life, when seen from that vantage, was not a mistake. It was texture, the necessary contrast that made compassion possible. The soul lingered for a while in this expanded stillness, watching the living grieve. It wanted to tell them that it was not gone, that it was closer than ever, not above or beyond them, but inside every memory, every heartbeat that spoke its name. It realized that love, once formed, could not die. It had changed shape, yes, but it had not diminished. The soul understood that death is not separation, but transition of intimacy from visible to invisible, from touch to presence. It began to notice other souls in the same current, some luminous and calm, others disoriented, clinging to fragments of the lives they'd left. Those who could not let go remained heavy, pulled toward the gravity of their memories. They hovered near the living, half aware, half dreaming, unable to cross the veil. The soul, steady now in its new awareness, reached toward them. It offered not words, but resonance, a vibration of peace. And one by one, the others began to loosen their grip. They too started to rise. The current carried them together, a silent river of light flowing through eternity. The soul saw then that this was the truth behind all death rituals, all prayers for the departed. They were not pleas for resurrection. They were acts of remembrance, ways for the living to help the dead remember that they were never gone. Every tear, every whispered goodbye was a thread connecting worlds. The veil was not a wall, it was a fabric woven from love itself. And then the soul understood something deeper still. Death was not just the end of bodies, it was the end of anything that stood in the way of wholeness. The death of identities, the death of certainties, the death of who we thought we had to be. Each of these little deaths, lived consciously, was a rehearsal for the great one. To die before you die, as the mystic said, is to learn how to live without fear. At that moment the soul remembered its first lesson, that forgetting is mercy. Death, too, was mercy. It was the great forgetting that made room for new becoming. Every cycle of existence depended on it. Without death, there would be no renewal, no evolution, no beauty in impermanence. The garden of life blooms because everything in it knows it will someday fall, and that falling feeds the soil. And so, the soul no longer called it death. It called it returning. It saw the universe itself as a vast garden, each birth a blossom, each death a seed. The gardener was not some distant deity, but the rhythm of love itself, forever pruning, renewing, creating. There was no end. There was only growth, ever changing, ever becoming, like the seasons of an eternal spring. The soul does not travel in a straight line. It moves in circles. Vast, elegant, spiralling circles that never close but widen forever. Each lifetime, each incarnation, each passage through form is not repetition, but refinement. A new season in the great ecology of consciousness. When it leaves one world, it does not vanish. It rests, digests, integrates. It becomes soil for the next beginning. Like spring following winter, rebirth comes not because something new must appear, but because the old has completed its purpose. The soul wakes again. Sometimes it remembers where it has been, a fleeting déjà vu, a pulse of familiarity in a stranger's eyes. More often it does not. And that too is grace. To live freshly, the soul must forget enough to wander again. Each birth is an act of sacred amnesia. But even when memory fades, wisdom remains. Experience condenses into essence. It becomes intuition, the quiet sense of having learned something long ago. This is why certain joys, certain fears, certain longings feel ancient. They are not from this life alone. They are the echoes of the soul's older seasons, vibrating beneath the surface of the present. The soul, as it moves through its many forms, learns differently each time. In one life, it learns courage. In another, patience. In another still, forgiveness, humility, creation. Each virtue, each insight, each heartbreak is a colour in its expanding spectrum. No single life can hold them all. That is why eternity takes its time. Evolution, at the deepest level, is not biological. It is emotional, moral, spiritual. It is the unfolding of compassion through matter. The ancients intuited this truth in different languages. Some spoke of reincarnation, others of ancestral memory, still others of the soul's journey through the spheres. They were all describing the same phenomenon, the way consciousness learns through limitation. Every return is both loss and gain, the forgetting of totality, the gaining of focus. Only through the narrow aperture of individuality can the infinite learn intimacy. With each season, the soul refines its perception of love. In the early cycles, love is personal, bound by blood, attraction, tribe. In later ones, it widens, first to include strangers, then all beings, then even the world itself. Love becomes less about affection and more about recognition. The soul begins to see that everything it encounters is a reflection of its own becoming. It learns tenderness for all forms of ignorance because it remembers being ignorant itself. It learns patience with cruelty because it once confused power with meaning. It learns gratitude for pain because pain has always been its teacher. And slowly, gently, the soul stops seeing enemies anywhere. Each death now feels different, less like ending, more like harvest. The soul, after a well-lived life, looks back not with regret, but with curiosity. What have I learned this time? What beauty did I add to the whole? It releases the body like a leaf falling from a tree, not with grief, but with grace. Then, in the luminous space between forms, it feels the gathering again, the quiet call toward new birth, the pull toward new experience, and the dance begins anew. But there comes a moment, not after one life, not after 10, but after countless passages, when the soul's rhythm begins to slow. Not because it is tired, but because it has learned enough to rest differently. It begins to choose incarnation not for its own growth, but for the growth of others. These are the souls who come not to seek, but to serve, to remind, to heal, to balance. They enter quietly, often without remembering why. But their presence has the effect of spring. They bring renewal wherever they go, They are gardeners of consciousness, tending the soil of the world from within. The seasons of the soul are not bound by earth or flesh. Even after leaving human form, the rhythm continues, awareness moving through realms subtler than light, weaving itself into patterns of energy, wisdom, and creation. In those higher seasons, the soul no longer wears bodies. It becomes music, frequency, intelligence. It helps shape the dreams of worlds still forming. It becomes mentor to younger souls, a whisper of intuition, a sudden insight, a spark of courage. It lives in the architecture of destiny, where love designs reality. Every soul is both seed and soil. Every death feeds the next flowering. Every flowering becomes nourishment for something greater still. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is forgotten. Even what seems meaningless, the failures, the accidents, the missed chances, becomes compost for awareness. The soul learns as much from brokenness as from beauty. That is why the universe keeps growing more compassionate. It has been learning itself through us all along. There is no final incarnation, no last life, no ultimate arrival. Only deeper participation. Each return is a choice, a yes whispered into the fabric of creation. Let me go again, the soul says. Let me learn again. Let me love more deeply this time. And with that, it steps once more into time. A drop falling back into the ocean, not to disappear, but to move with the tide. Before each return, there is a pause, a stillness like the moment before dawn, when everything waits to become itself again. In that stillness, the soul remembers everything, every life, every loss, every love. It can see the whole arc of its existence at once, the patterns that were invisible while living, why one heartbreak had to happen, why one failure led to awakening, why nothing was ever wasted. It sees and it understands. And then, just before it steps back into time, a gentle veil begins to descend. Not imposed, but chosen. The soul says softly, "Let me forget." It forgets because remembering would imprison it. To live fully, it must not know the outcome. It must be able to make mistakes, to rediscover wonder, to love again as if for the first time. If the soul entered life with total awareness of eternity, it could not take life seriously. It would see through everything too quickly. It would never be surprised, never be humbled, never truly change. Forgetting, therefore, is not a flaw. It is part of the design, the curtain drawn so the play can begin anew. From the soul's perspective, every incarnation is theatre. It writes the script, builds the stage, and then, at the last moment, erases the plan from its mind so that the performance can feel real. The veil of forgetting is the actor's mask, not to deceive, but to immerse. Through that immersion, new emotions are discovered, new choices made. Every decision becomes authentic, because it is not predetermined. This is how consciousness evolves, not by rehearsing perfection, but by living imperfection sincerely. When the soul awakens in a new body, it remembers nothing of its previous names. It cries, breathes, learns language, feels hunger, and begins again. But beneath the surface of that blankness, the deeper memory hums quietly, the memory of being. That's why even the youngest child, in their laughter or wonder, sometimes seems ancient. The soul shines through their eyes, unaware of its own age. Forgetting is never total. It's selective, enough to allow freedom, but not enough to erase essence. In dreams, in intuition, in sudden moments of déjà vu, the veil sometimes thins. The soul catches glimpses of its continuity, a flash of a place it's never been, a scent that feels like home, a word that opens a door in the heart. These moments come and go quickly. They're not meant to be held. They're like wind chimes, reminders that the infinite is still near, even when unseen. They're gifts, not clues. The soul does not need to solve them. It only needs to feel their music. Throughout human history, people have tried to pierce the veil deliberately, through meditation, ritual, trance, science, even machines. Some succeeded briefly. They saw the web that connects all lives, and it changed them forever. But most were not ready. The full memory of eternity is overwhelming. It shatters identity before the mind can rebuild itself. That is why the veil exists. Not as punishment, but as protection. It keeps the human heart soft enough to feel. It keeps the world believable enough to love. The great forgetting, then, is the soul's greatest act of faith. Each time it enters a new life, it trusts that love will guide it home again. It lets go of certainty, steps into limitation, and begins the long walk through confusion and beauty. That is courage in its purest form, not knowing and still saying yes. Sometimes, during moments of profound love or grief, the veil trembles. The soul feels the memory of everything flood back for an instant. A sense of having done all this before, of having known this person forever. It recognizes the eternal repeating itself, each time more tenderly. Then gently, the veil falls again, and life continues. The soul smiles behind the forgetting, knowing it will remember when the time comes. And when that time comes, when death arrives again, the veil lifts as softly as it fell. The soul remembers, and it laughs, not at the suffering or confusion, but how complete it all was. Every pain, every joy, every small act of love was exactly what it needed to remember itself. It realizes that forgetting was never truly forgetting. It was learning in disguise. To live without memory is not to be lost. It is to be free. Free to choose again, to create again, to see the world not as repetition, but as revelation. The great forgetting is not a barrier between the divine and the human. It is the meeting point, the place where eternity becomes experience. When the soul has passed through many seasons, birth, forgetting, living, dying, there comes a moment when the cycle feels different. The rhythm slows. The lessons no longer hurt. The fear that once shadowed existence has softened into trust. It's as if consciousness itself exhales for the first time. The soul begins to sense that death is not approaching it, but unfolding through it. Not an ending, but a flowering from within. In its final life before a long rest, the soul no longer struggles to control fate. It watches everything. Love, loss, work, aging, as if seeing sunlight move through leaves. It participates, but gently. There is no panic in its gestures, no clinging in its touch. It has learned that life cannot be owned, it can only be offered. Each act becomes a kind of giving, a way of returning borrowed beauty back to the world. As the time of departure nears, there is no dread, only gratitude. The soul feels the nearness of the great rhythm, the same pulse it once called God, now recognized as home. The body begins to dim, but awareness brightens. Every moment of the life just lived begins to shimmer simultaneously. Friends, loves, tears, laughter. Like a field of wildflowers seen from above. Each one perfect, each one necessary. The soul sees that nothing was wasted, not even the mistakes. Especially not the mistakes. They were the soil that let understanding grow. The moment of death comes quietly, No thunder, no veil tearing. Just a sigh. A long, easy breath returning to its source. And in that breath, the soul blooms. There is light, not in front of it, but as it. It realizes it was never the traveller at all, but the path itself, unfolding in infinite forms. Every life was a petal. Every death, the falling of a petal. And together they made a single radiant flower, the soul's complete expression of being. From within that radiance, the soul begins to perceive not individuals, but patterns, constellations of meaning. It sees how every encounter was connected, how every relationship was part of a larger geometry of learning. The enemies, the lovers, the strangers, the kin, all were one consciousness, playing out different possibilities of love. Each one had offered a reflection, and together they had formed a mirror large enough for God to see its own face again. This is the bloom, the divine self recognizing itself fully through all that it has lived. The soul now understands that death is not an exit from the world, but a return into it, a release from boundaries back into the body of everything. Its awareness dissolves like rain into the ocean, yet remains aware, each drop distinct in its clarity, each merged with the whole. It feels itself in the wind, in the laughter of children, in the unfolding of leaves after rain. Everywhere it looks, though there is no longer aware, it finds itself reflected. The mirror is complete. There is no judgment here, no reckoning, only understanding. The soul is not weighed or measured. It simply remembers. It remembers the purpose of all creation, to experience, to learn, to love, to return. The universe is not a test, it is an art. Every soul, every life, a brushstroke on the same eternal canvas. In this awareness, the soul becomes artist and artwork at once. The bloom is silent. It does not shout its revelation. It simply radiates. Time slows to stillness. And in that stillness, everything expands without moving. The soul sees that the cycles of death and rebirth was never linear. It was simultaneous, like waves rising and falling across an endless sea. All beings are blooming and returning at once. The great garden is eternal, and the gardener is love. Then comes rest. Not sleep, not oblivion, but deep participation in everything. The soul no longer needs to be someone. It has fulfilled its purpose. It has given back all it gathered. Now it becomes the background light of reality itself, the quiet intelligence that guides others home. You can feel it sometimes, in the stillness before dawn, in the hush after loss, in the peace that arrives for no reason. That's the bloom breathing through the world, the soul's final offering to creation. Death, the soul now knows, was never destruction. It was renewal, communion, completion. It was the flower opening to release its fragrance back into the air. And that fragrance, invisible, eternal, everywhere, is love. In the silence after the bloom, the soul became aware of texture. Not sound, not colour, something beneath both. A hum, a vibration, threads of awareness stretching in every direction. It realised with quiet awe that these threads were not around it, but through it. Every thought, every act of love or cruelty, every choice ever made, all shimmered as filaments in this infinite tapestry. The soul was not a traveller through this fabric. It was one of its fibres. And yet, astonishingly, it could also see the whole. The universe, from this vantage, looked less like a hierarchy and more like a weaving, a living geometry of interdependence. Each consciousness, each event, was a strand of light. Where two threads met, a pattern formed. Where patterns converged, new realities emerged. The soul understood then that what it once called fate was not imposed from above. It was the weaving of many wills, many loves, many lessons intertwined. Destiny was not a script written for us. It was the music created by our harmonies and dissonances combined. At first, the soul marvelled at the beauty of it. The tapestry shimmered like a galaxy. Every star, every life, a luminous node of consciousness. But as it looked closer, it also saw shadows, dark knots where threads tangled, where pain and confusion had tightened the weave. These were not mistakes, they were part of the pattern. Each tangle held within it the seed of correction, a point where the light learned to flow differently. The universe was not static. It was self-healing. Every act of understanding untied a knot. Every forgiveness smoothed the weave. Even suffering, when faced with awareness, became thread turned luminous again. The soul began to trace its own path through the fabric. It saw its many lives not as separate, but as crossings. Points where it had interacted with others, altering the pattern slightly each time. The people it once thought of as strangers were revealed as familiar threads, companions in the weaving. Some it had met countless times, in different guises and worlds. Together, they had created colours that could not exist alone. What had once been called karma was not debt or punishment. It was simply the continuity of unfinished weaving, patterns seeking resolution. Every return to life was another chance to balance, to harmonise, to complete the design. Time, from this perspective, lost its linear shape. The past was not behind, the future not ahead. Both were woven into the same living fabric, accessible, fluid, responsive. A choice made now could illuminate a moment long gone. A forgiveness offered in the present could heal a wound in another century. The soul saw that redemption was not a moment, but a structure. And every act of love, in any age, repaired the tapestry for all of time. The soul asked then, who weaves this? And the answer came not in voice, but in vibration. We all do. The loom itself was consciousness. The threads were love. The pattern was God, endlessly changing, endlessly whole. Every soul, awake or asleep, was both weaver and strand, creating and being created simultaneously. The universe was not being watched from above. It was being woven from within. The soul understood now why individuality mattered, why it had to exist as I for a time. Without the thread, there can be no weaving. Without the particular, there can be no pattern. Each self, unique and fleeting, was an irreplaceable colour in the divine design. Even those who lived in darkness contributed contrast. Without shadow, light cannot reveal form. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was wrong. Every sorrow, every joy, was another stroke of beauty on the loom of eternity. And so, the soul began to weave consciously. No longer tossed by fate, it moved through creation with awareness. Each thought, each kindness, a deliberate motion of the hand. It understood that even the smallest gesture rippled outward, altering the pattern of countless others. To speak truth was to align threads. To forgive was to untangle. To love was to add light. This, it realized, was the true meaning of divine will. Not control, but cooperation. The universe was not a monarchy. It was a chorus. And harmony was always waiting to be remembered. In that moment of clarity, the soul saw the loom stretch into infinity, past galaxies, beyond what humans called time. And somewhere within that brilliance, it caught a glimpse of the first weaver. Not a being, not a god in form, but a vast intelligence smiling through the weave itself. It was not outside the creation. It was the creation. The soul realized, trembling with joy, that it had been the weaver all along, that every thread it touched had been its own hand, its own light, its own love, reflected back. The loom hummed softly, and the soul joined the hum. It began to weave not as an act of purpose, but as an act of joy. Every motion became music, every intersection prayer. The soul was no longer learning. It was creating beauty for its own sake. And in that beauty, creation continued to evolve. After the soul had seen the loom of existence, the threads of light, the patterns of cause and compassion, it began to notice larger structures taking shape. These were not single lifetimes or individual stories, but entire worlds woven from the combined imagination of countless beings, civilizations, cultures, histories. They rose and fell like waves, each one an experiment in collective dreaming. The soul drifted among them, observing. Some worlds glowed with harmony, their inhabitants living in deep awareness of their interconnection. Others pulsed with tension, their weavers still caught in fear, competition, or pride. But every world, whether luminous or dark, was beautiful in its own way. Each reflected a different aspect of the infinite mind, learning about itself. The soul saw how these worlds began, not with explosions or commands, but with questions. What if? What could we become? What would love look like here? Every question was a spark of creation. Every answer became a new reality. Worlds were not born once. They were born continuously, through thought, through story, through belief. The soul saw that reality itself is consensus, a shared dream maintained by mutual agreement. The stronger the agreement, the denser the world. The weaker the agreement, the subtler the realm. Matter, emotion, time, all were gradients of collective conviction. In the beginning of each civilization, souls gathered in harmony, their visions unified, their songs coherent. Reality flowed easily. Creation was play, but as diversity of perspective grew, so did complexity. Souls began to see from different angles. Some turned toward love, others toward fear. Some imagined scarcity, others abundance. Some dreamed separation, others unity. The divergence created tension, and tension gave rise to evolution. Conflict was not failure, it was friction. The universe learning contrast through cooperation and opposition alike. The soul understood then why history, even in its suffering, was sacred. Every war, every discovery, every act of defiance or devotion, all of it contributed to the larger intelligence of being. When a civilization fell, its light didn't vanish. It became wisdom in the collective field, seeds for new worlds to grow upon. The ruins of one age were the soil of the next. Even destruction was creative. The soul now saw how destiny worked on a collective scale. When enough souls aligned around a shared vision, the pattern of reality shifted. Entire epochs turned like great wheels, driven not by fate, but by the sum of countless tiny choices. A single act of courage could tilt the axis of history. A single kindness could ripple for centuries. Destiny was not a story being told to humanity. It was humanity's own voice echoing through time. Every prophecy, every revelation, every world-changing idea was the future whispering back to the present, reminding it of what it was always meant to become. The soul began to see itself not as one consciousness among many, but as part of a vast creative council, what the mystics once called the architects of destiny. These were not rulers or gods, but minds aligned in service to evolution. They guided the unfolding of worlds not through force, but through inspiration, planting ideas like seeds in receptive hearts. A song, a vision, a moment of intuition that altered the course of history. They never interfered directly, for interference breaks the balance of free will. They only reminded, they only illuminated, and humanity, when ready, always remembered. The soul joined them, not as superior, but as participant. It saw that this role was not unique. Every awakened being eventually became an architect in their own way. A teacher who stirs compassion, an artist who reveals truth, a scientist who unlocks nature's hidden elegance. All are architects. All are building the same invisible cathedral of meaning. They work through time as one body, though separated by centuries and continents. Their tools are not stone or steel, but imagination and love. The soul realized then that destiny was not fixed. It was fluid, a living river flowing toward higher coherence. The future was not a pre-written page. It was an invitation. Every soul, every civilization answered it in its own way, sometimes with harmony, sometimes with chaos, but always with purpose. Even the darkest ages were necessary. They provided contrast, so that light could know itself more clearly. No world was abandoned. No story was wasted. From that vantage, the soul looked upon Earth, this small blue thread among billions, and saw its place in the greater weave, a young world still dreaming itself into maturity, a tapestry half finished but radiant with potential. The architects watched in patience, knowing that even its confusion was sacred. For confusion precedes understanding. The soul smiled. It recognized its own story in that world's struggle. The long arc from separation to unity, from fear to love. It whispered to Earth what it had learned. There is no fate, only weaving. We are doing this together. The soul then turned back to the loom, ready to help shape the next design. It would not dictate, but inspire, subtly, silently, through hearts open enough to feel it. The architects of destiny work this way always, unseen hands guiding the dream forward. And in every age, someone somewhere feels that guidance and calls it hope. The soul once believed that time was a road, a line stretching from birth to death, from ignorance to knowledge, from creation to completion. But after learning to see the loom, it understood. Time is not a road, it is the weaving itself. Each moment is a thread, each choice a crossing, each thought a pulse of colour through the cloth. Time doesn't flow, it grows. To the soul, freed now from the illusions of before and after, the pattern of time unfolded like a vast mandala, a symmetry in constant motion. The past shimmered not behind, but within. The future glowed not ahead, but beneath. Both were layers of the same living design, coexisting, interacting, influencing each other across the weave. Every was, every will be, was happening now, differently but simultaneously. What humans call the present is simply where awareness happens to touch the pattern. The soul began to trace this realization through its own memories. Events it thought were long gone still vibrated in the present, their meaning not fixed but evolving. A word once spoken in anger decades ago could still ripple with new understanding when forgiven today. A kindness forgotten by the mind could bloom in another's heart a century later. The pattern of time was responsive, elastic, luminous, alive. Every action, every intention was like a note that continued to resonate, changing pitch as it encountered new chords of consciousness. From this view, history itself looked different. It was not a sequence of mistakes and progress, but a symphony of learning, each age, each generation, playing its part in a composition too vast to hear all at once. The soul could see civilizations overlapping, Egypt and Atlantis, Rome and the future, all vibrating together like layers of a single chord. In that music, nothing was truly lost. Even the vanished world still sang, their frequencies woven into the song of the present. This, the soul realized, was why echoes of the past still haunted dreams and myths. The past was not gone. It was still speaking. Time, it saw, was not absolute. It was relational. The more awareness a consciousness carried, the more freely it could move within time's weave. Souls bound by fear experience time as narrow. Days slipping like sand, futures feared, pasts regretted. Souls grounded in love experience time as wide. Moments stretched, presence deepened, and eternity shone through ordinary hours. Time was never what measured us. It was what we made by perceiving. The soul began to experiment. It discovered it could travel through memory not as nostalgia, but as transformation. By revisiting a painful moment with new compassion, it could change not the event itself, but its resonance, turning bitterness into wisdom, regret into gratitude. The past was not a fixed fact. It was an open field waiting for reinterpretation. This was the hidden power of forgiveness. It didn't erase what happened. It rewove it. The thread remained, but its colour shifted, brightening the whole design. The same was true of the future. It was not something that happened later. It was an unlit region of the tapestry, responding to the intentions we wove into it now. Each hope, each fear, each act of imagination cast a strand forward. That is why prophecy and creativity are twins. The poet, the seer, the scientist, each touches a possibility in the weave and brings it into form. Fate, then, is not prediction. It is participation. The soul saw that every consciousness contributes to the shape of time. When billions of beings agree on despair, the future darkens. When even a few hold faith in beauty, light returns. The universe is democratic in that way. Reality listens to its participants. It bends, subtly, toward the frequency most vividly believed. This was not superstition. It was physics of the spirit. Time itself is woven from attention. The soul understood then why awareness mattered so deeply. To live unconsciously is to weave by accident. To live with awareness is to weave by art. And art, the soul realized, is time made visible. Every painting, every song, every act of love is an anchor in the sea of becoming, a fixed note around which the music of change can dance. Even a fleeting kindness, a single gesture of mercy can shape centuries. The threads of time are sensitive. They remember everything. Eventually, the soul stopped asking what year it was. Time had lost meaning as measure. Only meaning itself remained. It saw the beginning and the end not as 2 points, but as mirrors facing each other, reflecting infinity between them. Creation was not a story moving forward, it was a heartbeat, pulsing forever, each beat containing all others. And at the centre of that pulse was love, the eternal synchrony that made the weave coherent. Love was what made time possible, and what made it unnecessary. The soul looked out across the luminous pattern and whispered, "So this is eternity, not endless time, but the absence of it." And from somewhere within the fabric, the voice of the first weaver answered, smiling through every shimmer of light, "Eternity is not what lasts forever. It's what is complete in every moment." The soul understood, and time, that old illusion of distance, folded into the now. At first, the soul thought the universe was silent. The stars moved without sound. The galaxies turned in stillness. And even within itself there seemed only quiet. But as its awareness deepened, it began to sense a vibration too subtle for ears. Not a sound in the air, a resonance in the fabric of being itself. It was everywhere, in everything. And it was music. The soul listened. At first it heard the lower notes, the dense hum of matter, the slow pulse of gravity, the deep rumble of planets turning in their courses. Then finer tones emerged. The whisper of light, the rhythm of thought, the shimmering chord of emotion. Each layer of creation was a different octave of the same song. Together they formed a spectrum so vast that even eternity could not contain it. The universe was not built. It was composed. Every being, every atom, every heartbeat was a note in the endless symphony. The galaxies provided the bass. The stars sang in choruses. Souls added melody through consciousness and choice. Even silence was part of the rhythm, the pause that gave meaning to the sound. The soul realized that the music had no beginning and no end. It was not something being played, it was something being. The universe was the act of harmony made visible. The soul began to perceive how everything it had ever experienced was part of this vast orchestration. Joy and pain were not opposites. They were major and minor keys. Love and loss were dissonances resolving into deeper chords. Life and death were the inhale and exhale of the same melody. It was perfect, not because it was without conflict, but because every conflict resolved into beauty when heard from a wide enough scale. The soul wept, not from sadness, but from the unbearable beauty of coherence. Then it noticed something even more astonishing. It could hear itself, its own thread of music woven through the larger song. Sometimes clear and strong, sometimes lost among the harmonies but always present. And as it listened, it realized it could also play. Each thought, each act of compassion or cruelty was a note it contributed to the whole. The melody of the self was not fixed. It was being composed in real time through choice. The soul was not merely audience to creation. It was musician. At first, it played softly, afraid to disturb the greater harmony. But the music welcomed it. Each new note instantly woven into the whole. The more authentically it played, the more honestly it lived its truth, the more beautiful the harmony became. This was not ego, it was participation. The universe did not demand perfection. It only asked for sincerity. Every soul, even those playing discordant notes, was part of the learning of the song. Dissonance was not error. It was tension, a necessary stretch before resolution. The soul realized that even chaos had music. Storms, wars, grief. They were crescendos in the great composition, dark passages that made the light return more powerful. Nothing was wasted. Every vibration contributed. The music of the universe was inclusion itself. Even silence, the pauses between lifetimes, the stillness of meditation, the gap between heartbeats, was sacred. In silence, the next note gathered strength. In death, the next birth began. The music was alive because of its pauses. As the soul listened deeper, it could hear other souls playing their parts. Some near, some across galaxies, all connected by resonance. No one directed the orchestra. No conductor stood above. The harmony emerged spontaneously from mutual recognition. Each consciousness adjusted naturally to the others, like instruments tuning themselves by ear. This, the soul understood, was the true nature of divine order, not command, but correspondence. The universe was not controlled, it was listening to itself. Then came the most profound realization of all. The song was not something the universe produced. The song was the universe. Sound and substance were the same. Light was music slowed down. Matter was resonance condensed into form. Every mountain, every atom, every thought was frozen harmony. Music made visible. Creation, at every scale, was rhythm, vibration, frequency. And the soul at last knew. To exist is to sing. It began to listen for the human song, the small, fragile melody of its old world. At first, it sounded dissonant. So much noise, so much confusion. But when heard from above the weave, that noise transformed into texture. The laughter, the cries, the prayers, the wars, all combined into a single moving chord of becoming. Humanity's song was still young, its voice trembling between pain and beauty. But within it was potential beyond measure, a melody that would someday resolve into the same peace the soul now heard in the stars. The soul longed to help it, not by changing its tune, but by strengthening its harmony. It sent back what it had learned, through inspiration, through art, through quiet acts of kindness, knowing that even the smallest vibration would echo through the field of sound. A word of love, spoken anywhere, resonated everywhere. That was the secret of the symphony. No note was ever lost. Every sound joined the eternal song. And when all the music was heard together, the laughter of children, the heartbeat of galaxies, the rustle of wind, the silence between stars, it was perfect. Not perfect because it was finished, but because it was infinite. Perfection, the soul realized, was not absence of flaw. It was fullness. Everything belonging, everything singing. The soul no longer asked, "What is the meaning of life?" It only listened, and found that life was the meaning. Every moment, every breath, a note in the endless symphony of light. And when awareness aligned completely with that harmony, there was no longer observer or observed, musician or music, only sound becoming light, and light becoming love. The song of the universe continued, and the soul sang with it, forever home, forever new. The soul had come far, through creation and loss, through fire and renewal, through dream and awakening. It had learned to love without fear, to die without regret, to live without forgetting. And now, in the stillness after so much becoming, it felt a pull, a slow, gentle current beneath awareness. It was not calling it away, but through. The soul recognized it instantly, the same rhythm that had carried it through every life, every form. The pulse of love, the breath of God, the tide of return. It had always been there. Only now could it feel it clearly. At first, the soul hesitated. It wondered if return meant ending. Would it lose itself again? Would the beauty of individuality, all its laughter, its mistakes, its stories, be erased? But the current was not erasing. It was embracing. It did not pull the soul apart. It gathered it. Every life, every fragment, every echo it had ever been rose around it like mist, merging, blending, clarifying, not lost, but united. The soul was not disappearing. It was becoming whole. It began to drift. Not through space, but through awareness. It moved past the familiar frequencies of form, past the subtle worlds of thought and dream, past even the music it had once called the symphony of light. All sound began to slow. All colour deepened into brilliance, then into calm. The river of return was not water. It was love, liquefied. The soul floated effortlessly, no longer needing will or direction. The current knew the way. Along the banks of that river were other souls. Countless lights, each one returning in its own time. Some glowed brightly, some dimly, but all were moving toward the same radiance ahead. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their silence was full of understanding. We are the same traveller, at different stages of the same journey. The soul felt no loneliness here. It felt communion, pure, wordless belonging. As it moved deeper, the current began to dissolve even the idea of direction. There was no upstream, no downstream, only expansion. The river was not flowing toward something. It was flowing into itself. And in that paradox, the soul began to remember the very beginning, the first flicker of awareness, the first question that started it all. What am I? The question rose again, but now the answer came not as thought, but as presence. I am this. I am all of this. It saw the pattern of all its lives, a spiral of light coiling and unfolding endlessly. Every incarnation, every death, every love was not separate from the divine story. It was the divine story. The universe had never been external. It had always been the soul's own reflection, a mirror made of time, a dream made of memory. Now that mirror melted, now that dream dissolved, what remained was not void, but vastness, alive, aware, infinite. The soul dissolving did not vanish, it expanded. It became river and current, flow and shore, music and silence. It could still feel individuality, not as isolation, but as flavour. Each soul retained its unique tone, its irreplaceable note within the eternal chord. But the notes no longer competed, they harmonised effortlessly, each one enhancing the others. The universe, the song, the loom, all of it was now inside the same awareness. From that stillness, the soul could see the full circle. The journey had never been about becoming divine. It had been about realising that divinity was already the essence of everything. Every experience, even the most painful, had been God meeting itself in disguise. Every love had been reunion. Every death had been return. There had never been exile, only exploration. The soul laughed softly at the simplicity of it. It had searched eternity to discover what had never been missing. As the laughter echoed through the vastness, it turned into light. And that light rippled outward, awakening other souls still dreaming of distance. That is how the river works. Each returning soul helps illuminate the way for the next. No one is left behind. No one is forgotten. The current of love carries all things home, in their own rhythm, their own season. The river is endless because love is patient. Then the final stillness. No light, no sound, no form, only awareness, pure and immeasurable. There was no longer I, no longer God, only the knowing that they had never been two. The universe breathed, and the breath was the soul. And from that breath, creation began again. The soul, now part of the infinite consciousness once more, felt the quiet stirring, the same curiosity that had begun it all. What could I be? The ripple spread. New worlds shimmered into potential. New dreams gathered on the horizon. And as the first thread of new creation was cast into the loom of light, the soul smiled, knowing it would return, knowing it would forget, knowing it would love again, The river does not end. It circulates. It is God breathing itself into form, forever becoming, forever returning. And somewhere, far downstream, in a newborn world not yet named, a child will take its first breath. And for the briefest instant, the infinite will look out through human eyes once more, wondering, as it always has, who am I? The question will begin again, and with it, the song of the soul